Okay, good morning to everybody. Hope you can all hear me clearly. My name is Conal McAgasa, and I'm the chair of the Association for European Transport and Mobility Forum. You're all very welcome here for our, what is the 9th webinar of this season. Been a very successful season. And for this webinar in June, we're delighted again to be teaming up with the Journal of Urban Mobility and their publishers Elsevier for this webinar on the topic of mobility justice. This session is going to last for about an hour and a half, and at the end of the formal proceedings, we'll close the meetings and we'll leave the microphones and cameras on, so you can take the opportunity to catch up with some old and new colleagues. So we're delighted to be teaming up here with the Journal of Urban Mobility today, and with Benjamin Büttner, editor of the Journal of Urban Mobility. And before I hand over to him in a few seconds, there's just one or two notices which I'd like to give, please. So, Sandrine, if you can give me the line, please. So just to let you know, this is the ninth. Today is the 9th of our monthly webinars, and we have one more webinar which will be in next, which is being AET's Dynamics Group, which is led by Jerry Harrison of ITS Leeds, and they are speaking on the topic of what is systems dynamics and why use it in a transport research policy making. So that's like another very exciting webinar. And also just to let you know, of course, about European Transport Conference, which for the second year now from the technical 6th of September. Our early booking is already open. There are discounts available. Our draft program is going online this week, and we have a number of very exciting activities lined up. The Transport and Mobility Forum Group, which hosts these webinars. We're also planning to host at least 2 events at ETC this year, including resuming our informal debate on the evening of the first day of the conference. So keep an eye for notice and closer to the European Transport Conference. So that's the end of my notices. That's enough from me. I now want to hand you over to your host for this webinar, Benjamin Büttner, who's the co-editor of the Urban Mobility. I look forward to you introducing these wonderful of speakers we have, and everything about the Miro board and all that. Thanks very much, Benjamin.
Thank you very much, Conal, for the very nice introduction. Thank you very much for all attendees, and especially for our very prestigious speakers, 4 to be exact. I'm very much looking forward spending the next 1.5 hours with you discussing the topic on mobility justice. Sandrine, could you please put on the next slide? Yes. So as Conal already mentioned, this is a collaboration between AET and the Journal of Urban Mobility from Elsevier. It's a fairly new open access journal, and we are looking forward receiving your submissions on topics like mobility justice, but we also had 3 special issues. One was on the 15-minute city. Another one was on street experiments, tactical urbanism placemaking. So how can we create more livable, more just urban spaces? And we also have one in the pipe for the next European Transport Conference, ETC, which is, as you know, organized by AET. So expect a new one also on the topic of mobility justice. And from last year's ETC, we have one on advances in knowledge-based urban mobility solutions. So there is a strong collaboration going on between Elsevier, also EIT Urban Mobility, which is co-funding this journal, and AET. So thank you all for this opportunity, and I'm very happy having you all on board here. Next slide, please. why are we interested in the topic of mobility justice? We believe it's a very important topic, something that has been neglected for the last decades. So that's why we started our own research group on mobility justice with David Duran leading the way here. You will meet him in a second, and he will guide you through the Miro board. And thank you again for your very active participation. It's always difficult to make people interact in such a big virtual meeting. So we thought of a new experiment, and we set up this Miro board. But you will get a bit more insights in this in a minute. But thank you again for contributing to this. And please follow us and see what we've been working on in the past. And we would be also very eager of building a lively community on this topic. So make sure to leave your contact details in the Miro board. Yes, next slide, please. And something that is very aligned to this is a new special issue on transportation research part D, which is also headed by David Duran, together with Hannah Hook from the University of Ghent, Shaila Jamal from McMaster University in Toronto, and Tim Swanen from Oxford University. And this special issue will be about evaluating initiatives to combat injustice in transportation. So if you have papers ready, or you're almost ready, do not hesitate to reach out to them and submit this for this very interesting and important special issue. Okay, but without further ado, I would also like to give you a little insight on the agenda, which you can also find on the Miro board. Maybe, David, you can share the link on the Miro board so that everyone can take a look. We will have a little introduction to the Miro board and on injustice perspectives from the public, so basically from you, which is very exciting for us. This is the way how we can also get your opinions, insights, and then this will be followed by 4 excellent presentations. So Karen Lucas will start. Karen, most of you know, is a professor in human geography at the University of Manchester, and she will talk about transport exclusion and its social consequences. This will be followed by Jeroen Bastiaansen, who is a transport researcher at PBL Netherlands Environment Assessment Agency. And he will talk about access for all and analysis of inaccessibility to amenities and jobs in the Netherlands. And then we will have Todd Littman. I'm sure that most of you have heard of him or met him already. He's the executive director of the Victoria Transport Policy Institute. And Todd will talk about planning for more equitable transportation. And this will be concluded by Marianne Weinreich, who's the market manager from Rombol on smart mobility, Rombol Consultants in Denmark. And Marianne will talk about gender injustice in transport and mobility. So as you can see, a very nice mix of presentations and speakers coming from all kinds of fields. And at the end, we will conclude this with some statements from our speakers. So please feel free to use the Miro board, add your comments also to the presentations, and we hope that we can come back. But as you can see, we are almost 170 participants now. So opening this for extensive Q&A will be kind of difficult, but for this, we created the Miro board. And with that, I would like to hand over to David. David, please give us a little insight on the Miro board, so that everyone feels comfortable and finds a way of interacting during and after this seminar.
Perfect. So good morning, everyone. My name is David Duran, and thanks you, Benjamin, for this nice introduction. I'm very, very happy to be here and discuss these topics. We created together with Benjamin a new research group in the Technical University of Munich regarding mobility justice. And we intended to do something different that is also interactive. So I hope you could fill in some things about this Miro board, which is a new thing in webinars. And we are very, very thankful that you fill in this Miro board. So how this Miro board started, basically, we asked ourselves, what are people thinking about mobility justice? So first, what is the concept of that, and how can you interpret that in your own words? So we can get a little bit on the topic. So now you can see here this nice board, and let's start with these nice pictures that we can see here. And the question here was to upload a picture that represents mobility injustice for you. So feel free now to, unfortunately, we can not have everyone participating, but maybe you can write in the chat now, what or what patterns do you see in the pictures that for the people or now the participants in the webinar is a mobility injustice? So let's have a look. And maybe you can start typing, writing in the chat, what pattern do you see in these pictures? So what brings immediately to the people the thoughts of mobility injustice? Exactly, so the dominance and dependency of the car. It's super interesting to see that in most of the pictures, we have cars and problems that cars bring. So if we can have kind of one thought, one word, exactly, it's bad street design as well. So we can have here a tree in the middle of the sidewalk, and here also bad maintenance of the streets. We have here a very nice also newspaper article that says communities are speaking about the lack of healthy food availability, especially in low-income neighborhoods where there's not everyone has access to a vehicle and fresh food is hard to come by. So you can also see that injustice is perceived as the lack of access. Urban space distribution, we have only steps at railway stations, putting pedestrians in dangerous positions. So you see that it's basically this combat between car and also a bad design of infrastructure or inconvenient infrastructure and conflicts between different transport modes. Now let's go, of course, this is a problem. Now let's go to the other part. The other question here was, upload a picture that represents mobility justice for you. First of all, I would like you to compare the colors of these two. So if you see here, it's very gray. In this area, these pictures are very gray. Now, when we talk about mobility justice, we have a lot of color. That was the thing that called my attention. Now, I want to hear from you in the chat. You maybe also now see the patterns here. What, in few words, what do you think is mobility justice now for people? When we skip or we go through these pictures. Okay. So yes, we see so equality, equity, bringing people so the most needed what they need. Also breaking here some barriers, bring spaces, bringing some bring back to the city, social inclusion, including public transport. Active mode. So if you see the other transport mode, so before we were talking about cars and bad transport infrastructure, in this case, we're talking more about active mobility and public transport. So this is maybe a question that we can discuss further. Is going towards mobility justice is talking about planning more going towards active mobility and public transport. Is this kind of a similar thing? And we see here also, so here we have equity instead of equality, 6 words: accessibility, availability, safety, affordability, freedom, adaptation to different abilities. Yes, taking some barriers. And here, more access. So thanks for contributing. Now, and of course, we have here the nice 15-minute city. So maybe 15-minute city can be a way towards mobility justice. Now, let's go to some questions. So then we had 6 questions that was supposed to be answered in these sticky notes. So I asked myself, how can we cannot go one by one reading. Well, they're very interesting, actually. I really invite you to go and read the answers. There's very, very nice answers, very creative and interesting. And let's go to the first question. So the first question is what I always ask my students. Well, and until now, I see that's always a little bit subjective sometimes. What is mobility justice for you? And based on the answers that we got, I did a word cloud. So this means that when a word was repeated the most, then the word is bigger. And when you see what is for you, for the publicum, mobility justice, we read a lot about accessibility. So to provide access to reach activities and to meet people's needs. And I read a lot on also services, regardless the ability and the social group. So if I may kind of sum up these concepts, it would be something in that direction. And let's go now to the second question. And this is for me one of the most important questions is why is this important? Why is mobility justice important? And I asked this question to myself, because this is kind of what we have to, when we are promoting mobility justice, we have to be sure why are we promoting this, in order also to convince people in some projects to promote it as well. And here we have a bigger society. So a lot of you wrote that we have to do this to promote inclusive society, that people can participate in the society and really give them the right of the city, the right to have the potential to fulfill their needs. Then we have the other question is if you have felt some mobility injustices. And guess what? A surprise. The most examples of people feeling injustices has to do with cars and bad infrastructure. So it's always kind of their self-experiences meet what we saw before in the pictures. And last but not least, there were 3 questions regarding, so how can we really combat these things? And the question was, how can we combat this with the eyes of the academia, of the government, and from practitioners? In terms of academia, there was a lot of comments saying, okay, academia should make these injustices more visible and also search for new policies that governments and practitioners can apply. And then when we go to the government, then it was suggested the other thing, so that they should create and make it kind of available that these policies towards mobility justice can be matched. And finally, we have the practitioners, and it was very interesting to read that people suggest that they should be the ones that create these solutions. So those that kind of all the measures here and plans for actions that was kind of developed, or discovered by the academia, planned and suggested by the government should be applied by the practitioners. And so with this, I invite you to go through this, and maybe when you have time, read the comments. They are very interesting. And I hope this kind of opens now the interest, and also we can go now to our very well interesting speakers in this morning. So with that, I hand over this to you, Benjamin, and thanks again for contributing to this very interesting Miro board.
Yes, I can just echo what David said. Thanks again. I think there are lots of rich findings on the board. So please feel free to spend a bit more time here. Also in the chat, we have very interesting feedback from you. Maybe we could even paste a couple of these points to the Miro board to make this more or less complete. And with that, I would like to hand over to Karen Lucas. Karen, thank you very much for your time. It's a pleasure having you here in this webinar on actually your topic. Most people know you as a world-leading expert on transport and social justice, not just in the global north, but also in the global south. And we are very much looking forward as kicking the presentations off with you. And with that, I would like to hand over to you. Maximum of 15 minutes, the shorter, the better, but please use all the time that you need. So with that, the floor is yours, Karen.
Thank you. Thanks very much. It's really great to see you've done half of my work for me already, David. I really hardly need to present anything now, which is great. That'll help with the timing. So back in 2017, some colleagues and myself from the University of Leeds, including Duran, who is here presenting today, we made a report on sort of inequalities in transport moving forward. And I decided that I'd quite like to sort of highlight some of this in my presentation today. But I'll just be, rather than just going to a simple reenactment of the content of the report, I want to raise some broader questions about what we really understand about mobility justice, and whether this is actually what we really wish to achieve through our research, policy and praxis. So I don't think I need to really explain to this audience why mobility justice matters, or inequalities in mobility and reduction to access to services and livelihood opportunities that accompanies that. Is not only detrimental to the individuals that are involved in terms of their inability to be able to access jobs, get to college, health and so forth, but it's also a problem for society as a whole, because it means that they become basically benefits dependent, socially excluded, unable to participate in the activities that the rest of us take for granted, and therefore really become almost like outsiders of society, non-productive members of society, and then quite often penalised for that inability to participate. So I really want to think, when we think about mobility justice, not just about who's got what, but what the consequences, as Benjamin said, the social consequences of what we have if we don't address this issue of transport mobility justice, whatever we want to call it. We need also to have these pre-existing distributional inequalities, both the mobility and the social inequalities, at the forefront of our minds when we're thinking about the opportunities and challenges that new and emerging transport technologies and opportunities and projects bring forward. We need to think about it not only in terms of transport poverty or mobility poverty, but in a much wider sense, to embrace not only the inequalities in mobility and accessibility, but also the whole thing around exposures as well. But I think what I want to sort of say is, what is mobility justice? Do we understand what that is? Are we talking about equal rights to mobility for all? Or do we think that actually some people need more mobility than others? Who should be preferenced? Should we be thinking mostly about the people that are currently in mobility poverty? Or should we be thinking about the people who need to prop up the economy the most? What about the challenge of this reproduction of inequalities that are the consequence of transport-related social exclusion? And then if we decide that we want to give somebody equal rights or equal levels, well, what's the right level of mobility? Because we've got a climate change challenge and we need to radically reduce mobility, actually. So what about the excessive consumption of hypermobile people? Is this also actually about bringing their mobility down? Is that also part of mobility justice? Not giving more, but taking it away. And then when we thought about all of those 5 things, what do we want to promote? What do we want to ration? Why is some travel being valorized over others? Why do we think about commuting all the time, but not think about school travel? Why are we prioritizing our spending in sort of centre to city infrastructures? Because that might not be what we actually want to achieve. So basically, even when you start to try and look at, and here is I'm doing a project at the moment for DG employment and thinking about transport poverty they want to think about, but you can almost intersperse any one of these other terms: mobility justice, transport justice, accessibility, poverty, whatever you like, all comes under the same umbrella. But it's a definitional morass. And what do we really want? And I noticed one of the people in the chat room was sort of talking about thinking about affordability, accessibility, availability, acceptability, freedom. You know, does everybody have the right to have the freedom to choose whatever the hell they like to choose, to live wherever the hell they want to live, so that they can travel hundreds of thousands of miles a year, you know, when the rest of us just do 5,000 miles a year, you know, on average. So I think we need to think about all of these things, because understanding why what the definition is the fundamental conceptual framing of mobility justice is dependent on this. So what we decide is morally fair, deliberative justice, okay? What we as a society think is acceptable in terms of people's mobility and immobility and inclusion as well. And then we need to govern and regulate in order to allocate according to that level, that acceptance, that benchmark, so that we think we have a procedural justice involved, not just distributional. And then how we measure the distribution matters. Do we measure it just quantitatively? Are there qualitative elements? And then how do we recognize the social consequences and outcomes of these different levels of mobility? Because you've just been talking, David, about 15-minute cities as a concept. But actually, 15-minute cities as a concept would exclude most of the people in the UK, as Duran will probably tell you also in the Netherlands, right? Even in cities, right? So people can't get them. We haven't got the time to develop cities that are 15-minute cities. Not now. What we need to do is think about climate change right now. So how are we going to really decide a fair way to reallocate resources? And so these are some of the sort of things that I want to sort of put to the forefront when we start thinking about how we analyse research. So this is Greater Manchester. We've been doing some work with Transport for the North to identify, even in the context of this really heavy urban area, densely populated, where we've got issues of transport poverty. And you'll notice that Manchester, which is in the middle of the top row, is the city centre. And you can see that as you get further and further out with the outskirts, we have more and more problems in terms of accessibility, and thinking about composite indicators. So here, accessibility plus urban vulnerability, social vulnerability, including income, but also other vulnerability index. And then thinking about, well, okay, what's the risk of transport-related social exclusion? And doing that down to the level of the administration of the authorities that are saying that they take responsibility for addressing it, and are saying that their policies are trying to meet this. But in actual fact, even in Greater Manchester, where there's a huge concentration on investment in public transport, we're a very, very long way from meeting the needs of a lot of populations in that dense urban area, let alone the outskirts and rural areas. So I also think, though, that it's not good enough to just do these maps. We also have to think about how people are affected by this, as I said before. So it's like, well, actually, when we think about public transport, it's actually poorer people and families that rely on public transport, not rich commuters who are travelling around in their cars. But we keep designing systems for the rich commuters to get out their cars, but they aren't going to get out their cars, not unless we force them out their cars, right? And then we've got to do this. So it's, again, you saw a lot of things in that word cloud that David showed about solutions, but what very little about the fact that there isn't funding for solutions, that we're in a time of austerity, we're in a time of rollback. And so actually what's happening is not only is poverty and austerity for families and socially excluded people on the rise, but at the same time, and cost of living pressures and so forth, and as I say here, they're not just across the board, their gender, their class, their race, their age, ageist in their consequences, but also that local authorities have had severe cutbacks across the whole of Europe in terms of their ability to fund and invest in infrastructures. So, you know, we really, and services, revenue funding has always been a problem. You might be able to put in new infrastructures, but not necessarily new revenues. And it intersects with other inequalities. So what I said to you, we need to really be clear with the policymakers. If they don't do something, what is the social consequence? Kids are going to drop out of school. Teenagers are not going to go to college. People are not going to be able to take up work. Okay, and it affects the whole of society. It's not possible to segregate transport poverty from other forms of poverty. It stacks up. The same people are hit over and over again. And it's not just about work and commute, it's about other things to do with other forms of poverty, including things like energy poverty, housing poverty, and so forth. And it really matters to the people who can't do these things. It really means that they've got an emotional and physical burden on their lives. It's time consuming, it's draining, it's awful for them. And they feel really, really beleaguered. And it's not good to have people in society that feel like that, I don't think. Not if we're talking about a fair and just society. So thinking now, going to these opportunities for new technologies, which was the context of the report, and there's the link to it under there. We sort of did a job of thinking, well, what are the most likely things that are likely to happen in the future? Electrification's on the table, automation's on the table. We've got the whole thing about mass and intelligent infrastructures and assistive technologies and shared mobility services. And I would say, and we say in that report, that all of those things have the potential to worsen mobility inequalities or improve them. And it really just is dependent on how they're designed, how they're regulated, how they're rolled out, and the pathways to uptake. And I'm sorry, I'm rapidly running through this because you can read the report. But there are all sorts of challenges for mobility justice in the way in which these technologies are currently being rolled out, and also in terms of the way in which the trends in society are rolling out. So we don't have to be going into great detail, but loads of people on low incomes don't have a car now, so how are they going to have an EV? Poverty's on the increase, it's not on the decrease. And it's also, in most places, suburbanizing. It's going out of the city centres and into the lower income suburban areas. So it makes it much more difficult to deliver not only public transport, but all of these shared mobility options. How many people see an Uber operating outside of the city centre? Not very often, right? And we've also got this increasing idea that we can do mobility planning. And there's a fantastic project called Indemo, which has been running about trying to make these technologies more inclusive for disadvantaged groups. But there's still huge digital divides, not just rural and urban, but around illiteracy and skills. And so I think these things are the challenge for the types of new technologies that are being rolled out, and whether or not they can help the mobility disadvantaged. But there are also opportunities. We could, as a result of electrification, have huge health benefits. It could be much more helpful with assistive driving for people that have got virtual or physical mobility problems. Do we want them all to be in cars? If that's what we want, we want them all in electric vehicles. But even then, I think there are issues with mobility justice because of the space allocation that cars take and so forth, as we saw in some of those slides. And yeah, shared mobility options could be there, but quite often they're not available in low income areas. So how can we maximize the benefits and minimize the burdens? I think one of the big problems, and I spoke a little bit about this in AAG, so apologies, Benjamin, for repeating myself, but it's the very epistemologies upon the knowledge base upon which transport decision making is founded is biased and unfair. There is no such thing as a value-free engineering. You have to go in and you have to challenge the engineers to what they're doing. You have to challenge discriminatory institutional practices that often the policymakers aren't even aware that they're doing, that there's a gender bias when you develop cycle routes, for example, or that there's an inequality when you think about trying to improve everything in the place where the highest footfall is for walking, for example. So I think, sorry, I'm just returning to my final notes, but there's a quite a funny example from a blog from Charles Maron, who is a recovering engineer, he calls himself, and he says he's confessions of a recovering engineer. And he says that no matter what people in communities said mattered to them, or what the evidence showed, myself as a traffic engineer and other traffic engineers worldwide prioritize traffic speeds and volumes and flows over pedestrian movement and safety. So I was saying, like, mobility justice is thereby inherent in the basic design of transport infrastructures and their operational management as well, because that's what they do. But similarly, and we haven't got confessions of but similarly, the confession of a transport economist, who's trained to value journey time savings and speed and willingness to pay, which means wealth, over other attributes of the transport system. And that everything needs to be monetarized. So all those things you can't monetarize, then the economist is having a problem with, right? And then urban transport planners that are encouraged to design traffic-free places and spaces in the centers of cities where they'll benefit the highest footfall, exclude all those people on the urban periphery who never go into the city centre. And finally, I think even with the environmentalists and the climate change scholars who are really trying to get us to take up more active travel in the idea that we'll reduce our energy footprints and we can be more healthy and so forth, I'm quite often actually not really thinking about the people who are able or unable to do those things. So what I would say is that the job falls to the social geographers, the political and social scientists, to critically evaluate and highlight the decision processes and systems that create and maintain mobility injustices, and work collaboratively with affected communities. And this is important, work with the communities that are affected, because we don't know what they need. They will tell us what they need, and they will be able to then establish what we do in terms of funding, priorities and policies. If you leave them out of the equation, you will never be able to meet their needs. And so we then will be able to work with agencies that are already working with these impoverished groups to find out what the best way to deal with mobility justice is in a suite of a whole range of issues that is to do with poverty in general, who are mostly the same affected groups. So thanks for listening. I hope I went 5 minutes over. I'm really sorry. I accept that there's no questions for me. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Well, thank you very much, Karen, for this very concise, very complete presentation. I think this was an excellent kickoff in the field of mobility justice. I really like the idea that we need to challenge mostly engineers, maybe transport engineers, with that concept. And I think you showed it very well. Also, how we have to mix our methods. So you added some voices from people that are vulnerable, so that we can really create some empathy. But you also showed the TRSE, so the transport-related social exclusion maps for Greater Manchester, where we can maybe communicate to decision makers, policy makers. So I think that's very, very insightful. Thank you again. So maybe one question, first come, first serve, who's raising the hand. As Karen indicated, we don't have much time, unfortunately, but if there's one question, we can, no? Okay, so your presentation was so clear, Karen, which is, Sandra, you were first. Please unmute and maybe also open your camera if that's possible. Yes, perfect, we can see you. And yeah, floor is yours.
Karen, Lucas, it was very, very interesting. I was just wondering about the limitations of movements of people, and if you have thought also in the limitation of movements of goods as part of this puzzle. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And in fact, that should have been something else that was on that list of sort of what's up and coming. And obviously, one of the big things is this huge expansion of home deliveries. And, the fact that seems to be as if it's mobility neutral, but of course it isn't, you know. But actually, part of the reason I haven't focused on that is because of the online shopping phenomenon and the online working phenomenon doesn't really apply to most of the people that I work with. And in fact, they are quite often, even during COVID, were very mobile, or had to be mobile because they have to go to jobs and service carers and so on that actually required their mobility even during lockdown, and often working in external distribution centres, and they are the workers of Amazon, you know, rather than the receivers of it. So I think it is a really important equation, but I haven't personally done any work on that. I think there is a very big deficit in mobility justice that we don't think about goods. Thank you, Sandra. It's really goods movement. It's really important, as well as food, obviously, food deserts and so forth.
Yep, very important point that has been added. Thank you, Sandra, for addressing it, and thanks, Karen, again. Johan, I'm sorry, but maybe you can post your question in the chat, and Karen might be able to react on this in order not to lose more time. And with that, I would like to hand over to Jeroen Bastiaanse, who's a transport researcher at PLB in Netherlands Environment Assessment Agency. So we're switching from the academic perspective a bit to the more governmental perspective. Even though you're an academic yourself, you won PhD award, multiple even, one from Nectar. And Jeroen, we can see your screen. Thank you again also for your time. We'll talk about access for all and give some examples from the Netherlands. And we are very much looking forward to your presentation. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. Well, this study that I wanted to show was actually kind of inspired by the work I did with Karen in 2017, a report for the DFT on inequalities in mobility and access. And we kind of did a similar kind of study in the Netherlands. We named it Access for All, where we basically conducted an analysis of accessibility and accessibility to amenities and jobs on a national level, together with a colleague of mine, Marnix Bredijk, who's also in the audience. Just to give a bit of a context, obviously one of the main objectives, what we already talked about, what David talked about, Karen talked about, is transport. The essence of transport is basically that it allows people to access jobs, amenities like education, healthcare, the social contacts as family, friends. In other words, to fully participate in society and be socially included. That's also one of the main objectives of transport policy, to facilitate this access to key activities for people. It also means that the other way around, lack of mobility, or basically lack of access, lack of accessibility, can reduce people's participation in society, and in a more extreme situation can end up in transport poverty. So where people, for example, are excluded from work, remain unemployed because they cannot reach or access employment opportunities. They remain with healthcare problems, for instance, or cannot follow the type of education they would like to because they can't reach those locations. Now, you would say that in transport, therefore, in transport policy, you would aim at facilitating access, but in practice, we see that it mainly focuses, as Karen just referred to, mainly focusing on combating congestion, reducing congestion, facilitating traffic flows, and focusing on very efficient public transport connections. So mainly fast connections between the cities and from the potentially suburbs to the city centers, and not so much focusing on connecting people with jobs and amenities. And that's basically the starting point for this study. We developed Dutch national accessibility metrics using open data sources to kind of provide at the neighborhood level what the access to jobs and amenities looks like. Just to give a brief indication of how we calculated that, how we developed these indicators. We first looked at all the destinations. We collated made a collection of all the addresses of jobs and amenities in the Netherlands. So where hospitals are, where all types of schools are, education are, grocery shops, parks, and the jobs, like literally on address level. And then we calculate accessibility from the origin points, which are the neighborhoods in the Netherlands. It's developed by Statistics Netherlands. Around 14,000, just short of 14,000 neighborhoods with around 700 people living in each neighborhood. And we combine that with administrative microdata sets. So in the Netherlands, we have population data of the whole population. We know exactly where people live, or at least in which neighborhood they live, whether they are, what their educational level is, what their age is, and so on and so forth. So we know which people live, how many people, and what type of people live in certain neighborhoods, and therefore to what extent they're related to certain levels of accessibility. And then we calculated travel time. So we use OpenStreetMap. It's all basically based on open access data sets. We used OpenStreetMap, which is also used in Google Maps, for instance. And then we use that to calculate the travel times by car, and we corrected for congestion levels using traffic speed data. For public transport, we use the GTFS data set, so to calculate the travel times using all type of public transport services by bike, which is also included in OpenStreetMap, but we use bike app data, which is well, basically available for the whole country, to also correct for the fact that in some areas people cannot cycle as fast due to a busy bicycle lanes, for instance. And for walking, we did that. We calculated that per time of day, so in peak and off-peak hours, and by day. We used an average Tuesday and a weekend day, a Sunday. And since public transport services are highly dependent on the availability of the services, and frequencies are highly dependent on the specific moments of the during the day, we calculated it with 5-minute travel time intervals during peak hours, so between 7 and 9 in the morning, in the afternoon, and in the evening, and the same for Tuesdays and Sundays. Now, the main findings from those accessibility analysis is that we find substantial differences in accessibility, especially between people with access to a car that have by far the highest accessibility to amenities and jobs, even in the Randstad area, which is the main economic area in the Netherlands, and even during peak hours, by far, typically 4 or 5 times as high as people that depend on public transport services or a bicycle, for example. Not just, you don't just see this in rural areas, but also in these urban fringes and suburban areas. So apart from the city centers, where typically public transport services and bicycle, what is the infrastructure and accessibility are highest, outside those areas, you see that always the car is much faster, and the accessibility levels much higher by car. The bike, obviously, in the Netherlands, around 1/4 of all trips are made by bike. Also for commuting purposes, for instance. It contributes to accessibility, but especially these regional services, such as hospitals, such as secondary schools, are difficult to access by bicycle in rural areas, but again, also in these suburban areas and urban fringes. Just 2 examples. What you see here is accessibility within 30 minutes travel time by car, by public transport, and by bike. And what you see here is we calculated accessibility to hospitals from each neighborhood. And the darker the area is, the more hospitals you can reach. Now, what you can obviously see is that car accessibility is almost in the whole country. You can reach at least 1 hospital and often more than 1, like multiple hospitals within 30 minutes. If you would calculate it again, but based on 45 minutes, you see the whole country, including the furthest, the far north covered. So basically, by car, you can always reach at least a hospital. For public transport and for bicycle accessibility, you see that it's mainly concentrated in and around the cities and the urban areas. So even in the Netherlands, with a very extensive public bicycle network, see, it's very concentrated in those areas. And if you then match that to the population data, we find that around 30% of the elderly, for instance, cannot reach a single hospital or clinic within 30 minutes travel time by public transport. 12% also not within 45 minutes. A similar kind of share of the elderly population can only reach a single hospital or clinic. Very often just a clinic where you cannot go for surgeries and so on and so forth. So it's not just a very big group that cannot reach a single hospital, but a similar kind of group that can reach only 1 hospital or clinic, and therefore also relates to access to opportunities for a growing group. Similar kind of a pattern you basically find for accessibility to secondary schools. In the Netherlands, you go to between age 12 and 16, 17, 18, depending on the educational level you're in. We also calculated it here for car, public transport, and bike. Obviously, these young people are not traveling by car to school, but just to show the different patterns, the vast disparities in accessibility. Because again, in the whole country, from almost every neighborhood, you can reach at least one and typically even 3 or more secondary schools in the Netherlands by car. Again, public transport and bicycle is mainly concentrated in these urban areas. And here we also find that around 17% of young people cannot reach a single school for middle education, middle to higher education within 30-minute cycling. 10%, a bit lower for the young people that cannot reach lower education secondary schools, simply because we have more of those schools, but typically in similar kind of locations. But it's also affecting freedom of choice in terms of access to education here, because very often, again, similar shares of the young people can only reach a single school. So if that's not the school that you would like to go to, or doesn't offer the kind of education you're interested in, then that's it, basically. Obviously, typically politicians, policymakers say, okay, then just travel 45 minutes or just cycle an extra 15 minutes. The funny thing is, if you say that about commuting, the average commuting time by car is around 30 minutes in the Netherlands. If you say that about commuting, like, okay, then just travel 45 minutes extra, then it's a problem. Then it's in every newspaper and in the media and so on. But to young kids, they say, okay, just keep on cycling. Anyhow, these are the kind of patterns you find if you measure it from an accessibility point of view. Conclusions, my final slide. So these accessibility patterns to a large extent reflect these historical choices in terms of urban planning, design of the transport system, but very importantly, they're not invariable. Sometimes we see them, or typically they're presented here in the media as some kind of a natural way of things. But it's partially resulting from political choices. We've seen a shift of jobs and amenities to car-based locations, to business plots in the urban periphery along highways. It's a choice. The biggest sector in terms of jobs growing in the Netherlands on business plots, for example, are offices. Typically, the type of employment that you can easily, or that's very well fitted for more urban locations, or near central stations and so on. It doesn't have to be on these kind of remote locations that are very difficult to access by public transport or bike. And as Karen already mentioned, public transport also in the Netherlands is very much concentrated now on urban corridors and in urban centers, basically. But as soon as you move towards the urban fringes, to the suburbs, it's very difficult to get to, for example, business plots. Typically, if you have public transport at all, it's very much focused on the city centers and the central stations. And that's typically not where, for instance, the low income or low educated have to go to. Right, and then the accessibility analysis therefore provide important insight into the consequences of these political choices for different geographical areas, population groups. We found that they were very important and powerful, basically, in communicating inequalities in terms of accessibility to politicians, to policymakers, because now it's very difficult based on these maps to say that congestion is the biggest problem we have. You basically see that you can always get everywhere, even during peak hours by car. This was all based on peak hours. So in off-peak hours, obviously congestion goes down and car accessibility goes up, whereas for public transport, it's the other way around. Frequencies and service levels go down. So it basically shows you like, okay, but if you're dependent on public transport or the bike, it's always more, hey, your accessibility levels are always much lower, and therefore it's harder to get to places. And it helps also in the Netherlands, at least, to form or inform the debate about possible standards for accessibility levels, accessibility and potentially minimum levels of it. Because we don't have that. At the moment, basically, our national, regional transport policies are very much focused on improving accessibility, but not for whom and in what sense, and whether when it's good enough, when it's sufficient or fair. So that is basically where we are now. So far, my presentation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Duran, for your excellent presentation. Very insightful, especially also the maps, and you can already jump in, and I think it's very eye-opening, and I'm sure that this can inform the debate, as you said. And the accessibility for whom is a crucial question that is often neglected. And I think you made this very clear in your presentation. So thank you for this. Same procedure as before. First come, first serve. Is there? Ah, yeah, Karen. Very quick. Just wait.
No, really quickly, I think it's great what you're doing, and it's really is helping the agenda in the Netherlands, I know. But I do wonder whether, given there's quite a big emphasis on walking and cycling, whether you shouldn't also have some sort of metric of the conditions of the facilities in terms of air quality, safety, and those other things that affect accessibility.
Yeah, it's a fair point. I think we should include that. This project was just about accessibility. But the project we did before for the DFT obviously included those aspects, and obviously they're typically related. Areas where most people, poor people live, where accessibility is low, car ownership is low, are also typically, in the Netherlands at least, the areas where you have the big highways and lots of pollution created by other people. So there's a combination of deprivation, multiple deprivation. Yeah, so good point, and I think that's something we should look into.
Just wanted to keep you busy, you know.
We will. We should collaborate a bit more, Karen. Huh?
Yeah, I'm sure you will in the future, but let's discuss that somewhere else. Great. Thanks again, Duran, and also thanks, Karen, for the nice question. Feel free also to address more questions to Duran on the chat. Same procedure as before, but this we can capture more and not lose time. And with that, I would love to hand over to Todd Littman. Thank you, Todd, for your time, for your effort. Being here, unfortunately, this time virtual, but we met last time in Denver, which was very nice. And Todd is the director and also founder of the Victorian Transport Policy Institute in Canada. And he is leading, he is a thought leader in transport planning and policy analysis. Talks to many decision makers, and I'm sure you can share interesting insights here, Todd. So your presentation is on planning for more equitable transportation. With that, I would like to hand over to you, Todd, and thanks again for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Benjamin. Greetings from Victoria, British Columbia on the West Coast. I'm going to give an overview of my research on how to incorporate transportation equity into planning decisions. And I started off pointing out that putting this in the context of sustainability. So sustainability means balancing economic, social, and environmental goals. A lot of people misunderstand this. They think that sustainability is only environmental sustainability, but I argue that it is equally important to pay attention to social and economic factors, including social equity. So let me ask you, if we had a transportation system where everybody drove an electric car, would that be sustainable? Now, in my approach, I say no. Yes, shifting from gasoline-powered vehicles to electric vehicles does reduce air pollution and the need to import non-renewable resources, but it does nothing to reduce traffic congestion or accidents or roadway costs or parking facility costs or the cost to households of owning and operating a vehicle, and it doesn't provide basic mobility for non-drivers. So it doesn't help people who can't drive. It doesn't do anything to increase public fitness and health or to reduce sprawl and sprawl-related costs. So I would argue that electric vehicles are good, but they are not comprehensive. They're not a comprehensive solution. And I use this framework frequently. It's a matrix that looks at our various planning objectives. And it asks how many of those planning objectives does a particular project or policy achieve? Expanding roadways may reduce traffic congestion. And shifting to fuel efficient and alternative fuel vehicles. It reduces emissions and dependence on non-renewable resources. But it does nothing to achieve those other planning objectives. In fact, by stimulating more driving, what we call induced travel, expanding roads and shifting to electric cars can actually exacerbate those other problems, exacerbate traffic congestion, and increase roadway costs and parking costs. On the other hand, strategies that reduce automobile travel and create more compact multimodal communities do help achieve all of these planning objectives. So let's think about how this applies to transportation equity objectives. Now, in my analysis, I identify 5 major categories of transportation equity. 2 of the categories we call horizontal equity. That means we ask, do they treat everybody equally? And I'll go into more details about these in the future. The other major categories of transportation equity are what we call vertical equity. We ask, are we treating disadvantaged people fairly? And most of the discussion so far has been about vertical equity, focusing on meeting the needs of people who are poor or have a disability or somehow excluded. But I would argue we should give equal attention to horizontal equity. So let's see what that looks like. Or let me first say, equity is really difficult to incorporate into a planning process. If you try and address all equity concerns together, it can be very challenging. There are so many different aspects of transportation equity. So I recommend that you start off by defining measurable transportation equity objectives. These are measurable things that you can try and achieve. And so we can identify horizontal equity objectives and vertical equity objectives. I don't have time to go into the details of these, but you'll find them in the documents in the reports that I'm gonna share with you. So the first one is what I call fair share transportation planning. And that asks, does everybody get a fair share of public investments in transportation infrastructure and services? So if you drive everywhere, you would say, yeah, I want all of my my share of the road and parking and service infrastructure investments. I want them all spent on roads and parking facilities because I drive everywhere. But if you are a non-driver, you would say, I want my share to be spent on bicycle facilities or on public transit services or on sidewalks and crosswalks. So that's the basis. And in my research, I ask, how much are we really spending on different modes? And what my research indicates is that in a typical community spends far more on automobile infrastructure than on facilities for walking and bicycling and public transit. It's unfair. So now you would have to perform this exercise in your community. This data comes from North America, but there are a couple studies that I've been involved in, and it shows that even in Europe, there's a huge disparity on a per capita basis. So if you measure the amount of public resources devoted per capita, people who drive get a lot more than people who don't drive. Or to put it differently, people who drive more than average are cross-subsidized by people who drive less than average. And this is important because in a typical community, 20 to 40% of travelers either cannot or should not or prefer not to drive for most trips. And it's only fair that we make sure that people who don't drive get their fair share of investments. So in some of my research, I compare how much we're spending on walking and bicycling and public transit on non-auto modes compared with indicators of their demand. How much people use those modes, those non-auto modes, or would use them if we invested more. So compared with the amount that people travel, or traffic fatalities, or potential users, or mode share targets, most communities are significantly under-investing in walking and bicycling and public transit. Another type of horizontal equity, another horizontal equity factor is what we call external costs. That is the cost that one form of travel imposes on other people. And in walking and bicycling and public transit have much lower external costs. They impose less traffic congestion and less pollution and less accident risk and less barrier effect. That is the delay that motor vehicles impose on non-drivers. They impose much lower external costs on other people. And so you could say it's unfair when somebody chooses to drive that they are allowed to impose these external costs. And I should mention one of the biggest external costs is parking subsidies. And for some reason, most of the research on external costs in Europe totally ignores parking subsidies. So if there's one recommendation that I would make for you researchers in Europe, it's to start taking into account the inequity that occurs when motorists receive huge subsidies in terms of free parking. Now, let's talk about vertical equity, dealing with the needs of people who are physically or economically or socially disadvantaged. So one of the first components of this is what we call inclusivity. Are we making sure that everybody, including people with disabilities and low incomes, are able to take advantage of our transportation system? So, I mean, for example, this example shows a sidewalk that is, if you're a typical walker, you could get around that post. But if you're in a wheelchair, you would say this fails. This does not work for me. And so the term we use for making sure that we accommodate everybody, including people with disabilities, in our transportation infrastructure is universal design. Another component of vertical equity is affordability. So owning and operating an automobile is far more expensive than relying on walking and bicycling and public transit. So to the degree that our transportation planning favors automobile travel over the more affordable modes, it is increasing the disparity of wealthy people compared with poor people. There's another component of equity that's called social justice. And this is asking, are we taking into account racism and sexism and classism in our planning? For example, in North America, it was very common to build highways, urban highways that displaced low-income neighborhoods. And you could say we did that partly because those neighborhoods, those low-income minority neighborhoods, they had less political power than the wealthier neighborhoods. So there's a lot of discussion now in North America about how to correct for the injustice that occurred from highway building. So my research suggests that one of the ways that we can incorporate social equity into transportation planning is to make sure that our transportation system is multimodal, that we're making sure that it accommodates people who can't drive by having good walking and bicycling and public transit and integrating them, for example, by making sure that buses have bike racks and that you can, and that we have good connections between different forms of transportation. So you have good walking and bicycling for local errands, high quality public transit when you're traveling on busy corridors, and you only use automobiles when they are truly the best option. One way to incorporate this, one practical way that planners can use to incorporate to make sure that we're incorporating multimodal planning is what's called a sustainable transportation hierarchy, which means that we make sure that we plan for the resource efficient, inclusive, affordable modes like walking and bicycling and public transit before we invest in roads and parking facilities for cars. So we're not saying nobody should drive a car, but we're saying that where resources are constrained, so when you only have so much road space or a limited amount of money, that we would favor the inclusive and affordable and low external cost modes. There are a number of ways that planners can incorporate these concepts. One that's very common is that's becoming increasingly common, is complete streets planning, which means that instead of having a special plan for pedestrians and another plan for bicycle transportation and another plan for public transit and another plan for automobiles, each time you plan a road or a street, you make sure they accommodate all of those modes. And in fact, this is how transportation engineers and planners think. They don't think about modes so much as facilities. So we should make sure that all of our streets accommodate all users, that we apply complete streets. Another component of this that's come up several times already is accessibility. That is, where you live affects your ability to access services and activities. And as housing and employment have become more sprawled, we've seen a loss in accessibility, particularly for non-drivers. And so one of the key strategies for increasing social equity is to make sure that there's affordable housing in the walkable multimodal neighborhoods. So people who can't drive do have good access to services and activities. Now, let me end by saying that if you want more information, you can visit our website and you'll find reports that go into great detail about what I just presented. And I will put in the chat box links to three of my reports that are particularly relevant. So that's my presentation, and I'm looking forward to some discussion about what we presented. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Todd, for your very comprehensive overview. And thanks also for sharing the links. We will add them also to the My Report, if you don't mind, so that people can always find your reports if they haven't done so before. I really like how you ended your presentation, also pointing out at complete streets and how we can create accessibility by proximity. So bringing activities closer to people, also enabling them to use active modes and not being car dependent. So I think that's a very nice and important message as well. Linked also to affordability of housing, which is sometimes very problematic. Okay, same procedure as before. First come, first serve. First person can address a question directly to Todd. Okay, everyone is shy now, or is getting hungry in Europe because it's around lunchtime. Anyways, there were already questions in the chat addressed by Marco, for instance. So you can please elaborate on this a bit more, Todd. But let's do that maybe in the chat, so we have enough time for Marianne, who's our next speaker. So thanks again, Todd. Excellent presentation. And now I'm looking forward to our last speaker, Marianne Beinreich, who's the market manager on smart mobility at Ramboll Consultants in Denmark. Marianne, feel free to share your screen. Excellent. And she will talk about gender injustice, something very important, which we haven't heard much on today yet. So that's a great addition and also a conclusion to our presentation. So Marianne, thanks for your time. Great to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Benjamin, and thank you for the invitation to join. It will be a hard act to follow these great presentations, but yes, I will take a short deep dive into some gender indifferences and injustice based on a report that we have done in Rambøll. Yeah, just following on your introduction, I'm market manager in the Smart Mobility division in the consultancy Rambøll, but I also chair an organization called Cycling Embassy of Denmark. Just very briefly, Rambøll is a Danish founded but now international consultancy, and we work around the world, but very strong in Europe, but also US. And we are owned by the Rambøll Foundation, and they have also supported the research that I will talk about today. I'm market manager in a division that at present time covers these 9 different countries. When we did the report I'm going to talk about, we covered 7 of these. UK and Australia is not part of the research. So just clarifying that. So the research or report I talk about cover the other 7 countries from Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Germany, India, and Singapore, and primarily the capitals in these countries. And this report on gender and smart mobility is part of a series that we do every year, a so-called green paper, where we take a deep dive into a topic within sustainability. And in 2021, we wanted to really look at gender, because creating accessibility and green mobility, safe mobility, and efficient mobility for all is part of our service offering. So we wanted to actually also look into the gender differences to also make sure that we actually do that. And the report here is, as mentioned, partly founded by the Rambøll Foundation, but also public transport in Helsinki, in Stockholm, in Berlin, and by the Swedish Road Authority. And it consists of 4 parts. We did interviews with experts in gender and transport in all of those 7 countries, a total of 11 interviews. We collected existing data on all the modes available in those 7 capitals, and gender disaggregated them if they were not already, and if it was available to do so. We then conducted a survey among 3,500 men and women in those 7 capitals, 500 in each, and that is one of the things that I'm going to share some findings from. And then we did focus group interviews with a total of 40 women in those 7 capitals. And I'll just share a little bit of the different results. But of course, there's a link to the report that's publicly available. So feel free to dig into this. I will just scratch the surface here today. If anything, and you take away from my presentation, let it be that transport and mobility is not gender neutral. Actually, it is highlighted by the International Transport Forum that all research show that gender is actually one of the most robust determinants of transport choice. And having said that, it is actually a huge problem, because it is very often not included in transport and mobility planning, even though gender mainstreaming of all programs and policies are actually a UN requirement and has been since 1995. And one of the issues or challenges is that the transport sector itself is not equally distributed when it comes to men and women. Only about 20% of the people working in the transport sector are women. It depends on which sub-sector within transport. But it means that there is an unconscious bias in transport planning towards a more male transport, both patterns, but also preferences. And why is transport and mobility kind of gender unjust? Or how do we see the inequalities in transport? Basically, it's a reflection of the structural indifferences that we already see in society, in other sectors. It is linked to the fact that we still in the paid workforce see more men than women. It is linked to the fact that more women than men have part-time jobs. It is linked to the gender pay gap, meaning the distribution of resources are different, but also to the fact that about 75% of the unpaid care work in the world are still done by women. And let me just now take this opportunity to make a disclaimer. When I say men and women, I talk about what we see in the data. That does not mean that I talk about all men or all women. There are plenty of situations where this is not the case, but I'm talking about what we see in data and research, just to clarify that. And when we look at modes in general, but also in those 7 countries and capitals that we looked at, we can see that women walk and use public transport to a greater extent than men. Men, on the other hand, drive and use new mobility services like shared cars or e-scooters to a greater extent than women. When it comes to the bicycle, it differs depending on the level of safe infrastructure for cycling in the specific countries. For instance, in Denmark and the Netherlands, we have a 50-50% men and women cycling, whereas in other countries where the networks and the provisions for safe cycling are much lower, we see 80, 70, 60% men cycling. And research also show, for instance, the Australian researcher Jan Girard has pointed and seen in research that the share of women cycling in a city is an indicator for how safe that city actually is for cycling, simply linked to the fact that in general in life, research show that women are more averse to risk than men. And when it comes to cycling, cycling safety is of great importance to women. And again, also linked to the fact that women, to a greater extent than men, accompany children and other family members, where the need for safe cycling infrastructure is even bigger. When it comes to travel patterns, we see that men typically have traveled longer distances than women, but have a simpler home to work commute pattern. And that's actually the pattern that we plan public transport for. But women, to a great extent than men, travel shorter distances, but have a more complex trip patterns, also linked to a great extent to the unpaid care work chores, accompanying children or other family members, doing grocery shoppings, running family errands, and having this trip chaining pattern that we, to a great extent, fail to actually plan for. We also see that when it comes to when you travel. We see that women think more about which route to take, what time of day they need to travel has an influence on mobility, and that is also linked to fear of harassment and assault. It is more personal safety issue than traffic safety issue, and to some extent that also limits women's mobility. Looking into just some of the findings in our survey to just support these very general findings. We asked in the survey about the challenges faced when using different modes, but also about the connotations and associations linked to different modes. And an example when it comes to the challenges and concerns related to walking, we see that it is the top 3: weather conditions, traveling with groceries and bag, and travel time. It is fairly the same between men and women, except for traveling with groceries and bags, where women significantly more than men point to that as a challenge and concern while walking. And for women, on 4th place comes personal safety linked to harassment and assault, with 21%, whereas only 14% of men pointed to that. Again, as mentioned, when it comes to cycling, we see that significantly more women than men point to traffic safety as a challenge and a concern related to cycling. We also, again, have weather as the number 1 challenge, and quite fairly distributed. And then I just want to highlight one of the findings related to cars that was about the word associations with cars. And for both men and women, it's comfortable, it's fast, but then it changes a little bit. And women have on 4th place that the car, and that is the only mode that this comes up, associates the car with feeling personally safe and secure in terms of that personal feeling of safety. And that we definitely need to be aware of when we are talking about, getting people out of cars and into public transport and walking and cycling, because for women there is some safety related to the car if they have access to using a car. But also when it comes to the focus groups, we saw that basically across the 7 capitals, we saw that almost identical testimonials from Helsinki to Singapore about the strategies that women have developed, especially when walking and using public transport at night, about walking with keys in between the fingers, changing shoes, or pretending to be on the phone, or actually being on the phone with people, and simply because they have fears or have experienced harassment or assault walking or using public transport. But also how the design of our streets, stations, and bus stops really influences how they feel, and how they would rather have a longer travel time by bus or train than having to change bus or train and wait at a platform or at a bus stop. But also the need for safe cycling infrastructure, and how cycling really could benefit them in their daily mobility and travel and the things they need to do. But also, for instance, in Copenhagen, where that is in place, the women in Copenhagen saying how cycling is empowering, how they feel strong and safe cycling at night, which they would much rather do than walking or using public transport. So much to do also related to feeling of safety and security. I won't go into detail here, but in the report, we also have a number of recommendations related to including gender and gender mainstreaming into transport and mobility planning. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And I'm sorry if I used a little bit more time than allocated.
That's okay. Thank you very much, Marianne. It was very interesting. So time well spent and very interesting insights. And I'm happy that you also brought the gender topic into this discussion, which is very relevant, and also how we should plan gender neutral. And I like that you mentioned that transport is not gender neutral, and that's a very important thing where we should all question ourselves and also change the perspective and think about people that might not feel comfortable taking a certain mode or taking a certain route. Okay, so we already have Heather, and this is the only question that we can allow at this point, but again, feel free to use the chat. Heather, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone.
I think we lost.
I have my.
Yeah.
You have my. Yeah, you can hear me now.
Now
okay.
We can hear you. Yes.
Okay, perfect. So to be really quick, I'm really interested in knowing if anyone on the webinar or if you, Marianne, have any suggestions. I know that I share exactly the same findings as you, in that women are heavily influenced by the design of streets and infrastructure. But so what does gender sensitive or gender improved design of streets and infrastructure and stations actually look like? Because that is something that it's very easy to say, but it's really difficult to find out about. So I'd be interested to hear anyone's views on that. Thank you.
Just from my perspective and what we have discussed with us is about, first of all, of course, realizing that this is a thing, and that it is from accessibility to the stations, to how you create those eyes that is not just CCTV cameras, but are actually interactions with other people, that there are people there. That was something that the women in the focus group interviews mentioned, the ability to talk to real people and making sure that it is nicely lit, that you have those, that it can be also functions like small shops or kiosks, or where you feel that there is somebody who you can reach out to. Also making sure that it is not built in a way where people can hide. You feel that they can hide on the corners, or they mentioned, for instance, that a street that is very cozy at daylight, with a lot of bushes and benches and corners and small places to linger, suddenly can feel very unsafe at night when it's dark, and you feel people can be hiding there or lurking. So really looking at it from that perspective, and I'm sure we will see much more of this realized, and we are already, I think, having projects around the world that take this into consideration. Yeah, it didn't answer your question in full, but I think we will see that.
It's difficult.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, so we have Bettina, and after that we have to close this round. Bettina, please.
On the same theme, what can be done to make transport more gender sensitive? This would also help other people. Toilets, public toilets, which are clean, most of all open when you need them, especially in the UK. That's a disaster area. We're virtually, it virtually isn't there anymore. Then basic comfort factors, such as heating in bus stations. There are many bus stations in the UK without heating of any description, with very hard, very cold seats. So it's really off-putting to anyone but it might be particularly off-putting to women.
Yeah, very, very valid point. Marianne, do you want to react on this or?
No, very good points to highlight, and that is also some of the things highlighted in the book that actually inspired this report. The Carolina Criado Perez's Invisible Women, Exposing Data Bias in a World Designed for Men, that I will really recommend everybody interested in this topic, not just for transport, but in general. That is very relevant and also points to some of the inequalities that we really need to address to basically create better communities and cities and transport for all. Because when we cater for these needs for women, it also works for all the men and every, that travel with children or suffer the consequences of these lack of comfort or challenges.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for this. Maybe you can put the book also in the chat so that we can add this to the Miro board as a collection of this very nice webinar. And I would like to close the session if you agree. Unfortunately, we are already 5 minutes past our initial end time, but I would like to close it with one question to each of the presenters. And this question would be, how would you combat mobility injustices in your professional field? And Marianne, feel free to start, and then Jérôme, and then Todd will close the session as Karen had to leave.
Yeah, sorry, I was just typing. So
yeah. That was unfair by me. Apologies.
Can I be last?
Yes, of course, you can be last. So,
thank you.
Jérôme, maybe you can give a bit of a governmental perspective how you could combat mobility injustices.
My experience is that they really want to see figures. They want to see some quantitative data. We had quite a lot of qualitative studies on transport poverty, but at the ministry and politicians really want to know, okay, how many people does it relate to? So I do think that studies like ours, using accessibility calculations, really help to bring it to the fore.
Great. Very good point. Thanks for this, Jérôme, and I will hand over to Todd.
Yes, I think it is important to give equal attention to horizontal equity. If we say we want more investments in public transit or better washrooms in public transit stations or better sidewalks that accommodate everybody, including people in wheelchairs, if we frame it as a special problem, a narrowly defined problem for a special group of people, we often get token solutions. We get what I describe as programmatic solutions. So there'll be a special investment or a special project to address the special needs of people in wheelchairs or the special needs of women. But if we frame it as a fair share planning and reducing external costs, we can justify major structural reforms. So for example, investing less in highways and investing more in walking and bicycling and public transit, it helps virtually everybody, including motorists who benefit from reduced traffic and parking congestion and reduced chauffeuring burdens and reduce air pollution and accident risk. But if we frame it as something for a special group of people, we might get, let's say, a 5 or 10% shift in funding. If we frame it as making sure that everybody, all non-drivers, get their fair share and that we're reducing external costs, we can justify huge shifts away from automobile-oriented planning to more multimodal planning. So I would recommend defining the problem broadly
Yep.
and making sure that all the social equity or inequities are being considered.
Great point made. Thanks, Todd. And I will hand over to Marianne to close this round.
Yeah, thank you. I think I would say understanding biases and inequalities, and of course, data is a key to exposing that and showcasing and understanding where the inequalities are, but also understanding our own biases in planning.
Great, excellent point. Thanks to all. Thank you to all participants as well. I'm really excited to see the Miro board, how it has been filled up before this meeting, also during this webinar. We will leave it open also after the webinar, so please take a look, add your points, also your questions. We will put the valuable comments from the chat also on the Miro board, and we will create a report based on this that we are happy to share with you. So leave your email on the Miro board in order not to miss the report. We don't have an exact time frame for that, but as soon as possible, maybe within 2 weeks or a month maximum. And with that, I'm really happy that you all participated in such an active manner. I would like to thank the excellent speakers, Todd, Duran, and Marianne, as well as Karen, who unfortunately had to leave. And with this, I would like to hand over to Connell to announce the ETC, the European Transport Conference in Milan, maybe an opportunity where we could meet in person. So Connell, the last words.
Thank you very much, Benjamin, and congratulations to you and your team and David Duran, who managed to bring together this really excellent and what has been an uplifting and inspiring talk I think for everybody. And I think this is only contributing to part of the conversation, and we at the Transport and Mobility Forum are delighted to have been able to provide the platform and the space to have this discussion. And I look forward to further collaborations with you, Benjamin, and your team at the Journal of Urban Mobility. But we don't have to wait too long to discuss this theme again, because you may, I can let you know that that Benjamin and his team are working closely with the European Transport Conference conference management team. We are developing a special joint session at the ETC in Milan in September, again on a theme of mobility justice. So we look forward to seeing all of you, or as many of you as possible, in Milan to continue this discussion. So thank you again to Benjamin. Thank you to those wonderful speakers for your real insights. And if I can, from my own perspective, just there was a number of things that jumped out at me. But the one that stuck in my head is the quote that Todd put up from the mayor of Bogota, who said that in developing countries are not where the poor are driving cars, but where the rich are using public transport. And we have to work to those kind of visions and goals of getting a more equitable, building more equitable society. So really, thank you very much for a really outstanding webinar, one of our highest attendance. And just to remind you, the recording of this will be available on the AET website, and it will also be available via the LinkedIn of the JUM. I think the details were given earlier on the chat. So thank you really very much to all the participants. As is our tradition, we leave the machine, we'll leave the Zoom machine on. You can leave your cameras open your mics, and if you see the formal proceedings are now over, so if you want to catch up with some people, please do. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Thank you very much.